Okay, let's take a look at Garland-Thomson's essay on misfits. There's a lot going on in this text, and so in this video we'll try to parse out some of the key points that Garland-Thomson is trying to make. And she is making three distinct arguments in this text, so there's more than one overall claim happening here, although we could probably extract an overall thesis from this. She does say at the outset that she's making three distinct arguments. And the first argument that she's making is that the concept of misfits emphasizes the uniquely particular lived embodiments of persons with disabilities and avoids a kind of generic category of disabled bodies. The second argument that she makes in this text is that the concept of misfit clarifies conversations in feminism about vulnerability and dependence. And the third argument that she makes in this text is that because the concept of misfitting embraces a shifting spatial and temporal relationship among bodies and environments, it allows for the agency and value of disabled subjects, unlike other biologically based arguments about persons with disabilities. So the concept misfit is offered here as a way to think about the lived identity and embodied experience of disability. This shifts the focus from disability as lack or flaws or disadvantages in bodies to a kind of relational ontology which emphasizes fluid engagements of particular bodies with particular spatial and temporal environments. So, misfitting describes the ways in which particularly embodied beings interact with their environments. And so, disability for Garland-Thomson is about both bodily experience and it's about social justice. The terms fitting and misfitting indicate an encounter between two things, which are either in harmony or not in harmony. So rather than a focus merely on bodies and what's wrong with bodies and how they're deficient or lacking in some ways, the focus with the concept of fitting and misfitting is on the relation between two things, bodies and their environments. So a fit is a congruent, harmonious relation between two things, whereas a misfit is an incongruent, inharmonious relation between two things. She gives the example of trying to put a square peg in a round hole. We can't look at the square peg and say, there's just something deficient about that square peg. If it was a good square peg, it would fit in that round hole. There's something essentially wrong with the hole because the square peg doesn't fit in it. So there's nothing wrong with the things themselves, essentially, but there's something wrong about the relation between the two things. They misfit. Garland-Thomson goes into more detail discussing how a fit means to be of such a size and shape as to fill exactly a given space or conform nicely to the contour of a given space, or to be adjusted or adjustable to a certain position. Whereas a misfit means an inaccurate fit, and hence a kind of unsuitability or a disparity or inconsistency. A failure to fit, a bad fit, to be unfitting or inappropriate. And so with the square peg and the round hole, there's nothing inherently wrong with either the square peg or the round hole. There's simply an incongruent relation between those two things. Yet, as space and time shifts, relations themselves shift, and the fits between things shift. So the context of the relation is important rather than the essence of the two things in relation to each other. And in this way, misfitting allows a theorization of disability as a way of being in an environment, a kind of material arrangement or relationality. And on this view, injustice and discrimination are located in the materiality of the world rather than only in social attitudes or linguistic practices. Although on Garland-Thomson's view, she's calling for a kind of material semiotic account in which she wants to attend to both nature and culture, the material and the social. She's drawing on a recent history in material feminisms that wants to reject the inclination of feminists to respond to essentialism by focusing solely on the social aspects of the world. So Garland-Thomson is coming in and saying, look, yeah, there is something wrong about social attitudes and the ways in which we hold certain kinds of privileges and ideals and the way in which we oppress others, but it's not all about the social. There are material aspects of our world in which injustice and discrimination are located, and so we have to look at the relations that manifest these kinds of discriminations and injustices. And in order to do that, we have to look at the material environment as well as the social environment. And so looking at things in terms of a relational ontology that considers both the material and social aspects of the world, a fit occurs when there's a harmonious interaction, a particularly shaped and particularly functioning body, and an environment that in fact sustains that particular body. Whereas a misfit occurs when the environment does not sustain the particularly shaped and particularly functioning body that enters into relation with it. So the point of civil rights legislation is to enlarge the range of fits, accommodating the widest possible variation. So as we talked about previously with Wendell's essay and Ogiemi's essay and lots of the texts that we've looked at this semester, we have these kinds of notions of social categories that are based on biologic. That is, we put certain kinds of bodies, Fausto Sterling, into social categories, and we try to control the bodies to make them represent the ideal that the category or group is organized around. Yet bodies vary greatly and environments vary greatly. And so, on Garland-Thomson's view, the whole point is not to change bodies, but to change the ways in which certain bodies can fit or misfit with the environment. That is, the point of civil rights is to help accommodate bodies in such a way that they fit rather than misfit with the environments that we construct and maintain. So in Garland-Thomson's view, people with disabilities become misfits not simply due to social attitudes. So of course she's rejecting the claim, along with Wendell, that misfitting or disability is located simply in somebody's body, that there's a lack or flaw or deficiency in a body. But she's also rejecting the claim that disability comes only from social attitudes. But she wants to emphasize the ways in which disabilities become misfits in material ways through relations with environments. So when there's a misfit between a specific body and an environment, there's a literal casting out or exclusion that results in segregation based on particular body types. For example, when a wheelchair user encounters stairs, they do not have access to the space. Yet, when a wheelchair user encounters an elevator, they do have access to enter the space. And this is the case whether or not the space is filled with persons who have attitudes that are felicitous to persons with disabilities or not. So the materiality of the world makes a difference to the inclusion of persons with disabilities and their ability to fit with a given environment. So the oppression of people with disabilities, like other kinds of oppressions that we've talked about in this class, do come in part from attitudes and language, but it also comes from material environments. With respect to misfitting and identity, Garland-Thomson discusses how when persons tend to easily fit in relation to their environments, fits tend to produce what she calls material anonymity. And this is a way of being in the world that is ordinary and unmarked. So this is something like Lugonis's being at ease. And so those who are unmarked, and we've been talking about gender and racial oppression and the kinds of binary categories that go along with oppressions and the history of social identity, beginning with self and other, subject and object, male and female, heterosexual, non-heterosexual, white, non-white, able-bodied, disabled, and so on and so forth. We could come up with several of these kinds of binaries where one of the pairs in the binary is unmarked or neutral, an ideal, and the other pair in the binary is marked, not neutral, not ideal, and also not anonymous. Being anonymous yields privilege, which is conferred by access to particular kinds of spaces and through the performance of certain tasks in the establishment of relationships, allowing unmarked anonymous persons the full rights of citizenship and personhood. And how we look at each other determines how we make our way through the world and how we treat one another. Recall Beauvoir's account of recognition theory, how being othered happens when males recognize females as other, and females internalize this. Same thing with whites and non-whites, heterosexuals and non-heterosexuals, able-bodied and disabled, cisgendered, non-cisgendered, and so on and so forth. And we can think about Lugonis's world traveling with respect to misfitting and recognition. With respect to misfitting and identity, we can think about Ogiemi's account of biologic, and we can think about Bartkey's psychological oppression and psychic alienation. And so our perception of others, and thus our perceptions of ourselves, are a learned ability that is context dependent. It's complex, it's fluid, not static, and it depends on our fittings and misfittings with our environments. We move, meet, negotiate, make contact with the built and natural world, which sustains our embodied lives. And these relations depend upon our material particularity, the way we look, the way we function, yet the substance of our bodies can be reshaped to some degree. So we're fluid, but somewhat stable. So both bodies and environments are fluid, yet somewhat stable. Social justice requires that equal access is achieved by changing the shape of the world, not by changing the shape of our bodies. And this should be evident certainly in Fausto Sterling's account as well as in the texts on disability. Everyone should be allowed to participate fully in public life without being forced into normalization and without being excluded, oppressed, or harmed. So fitting is this kind of comfortable and unremarkable experience of anonymity that allows us to forget the truth of contingency since the world sustains us. This is similar to Lugonis's account where she talks about people who are privileged. So in our society, especially middle-class, white, Christian, heterosexual, cisgendered males. People with a great deal of privilege don't have to travel to other worlds. They don't have to be aware of the ways in which differences affect people's lives because they already embody the norms or the ideals of personhood. And so they can walk through the world anonymously and unmarked, which also allows them to not have to travel to others' worlds and understand the ways in which others experience misfits with the built environment. And so this way of being, this anonymous, privileged way of being, is comfortable, and it allows us to forget that fitting is contingent because the world sustains people in certain ways. So the world has been built in a way that sustains particular kinds of bodies and fails to sustain other kinds of bodies. The dominant cultural story of human development is that our shapes, our bodies, are stable, predictable, and manageable. Again, think about Fausto Sterling and the medicalization of intersex infants. But unlike fitting, Misfitting is an uncomfortable and remarkable experience, rather than anonymous experience, that illuminates contingency by exposing the relational component of fitting and the fragility of fitting. Any of us can fit here now and misfit there tomorrow. In fact, many of us will, in some moments, in some environments, fit, and in other moments, in other environments, misfit. But our social identities have a great deal to do with the ways in which we fit or fail to fit, because the environment is built to sustain certain kinds of bodies. So misfitting allows for an awareness of social justice and for subjugated knowledges to emerge, although it also leads to segregation and exclusion from the rights of citizenship and alienation from the community. So on the one hand, misfitting is oppressive and exclusionary, but on the other hand, that oppression and exclusion allows for an awareness of social injustice and an awareness of subjugated knowledges that persons who easily fit, because the world sustains them, don't necessarily have access to these kinds of knowledges or awareness of the needs for social justice. So much of the disability rights movement grew from solidarity through experiences of misfitting. And if you look at their protest practices, this is quite evident. When disability groups stage protests, they often employ practices that perform their misfitting, throwing themselves out of their wheelchairs, crawling upstairs. This makes it clear that there's not simply something wrong with their bodies, but there's something wrong with the fit between their bodies and the environments that are built to sustain certain kinds of bodies. In terms of dependence and vulnerability, the concept of misfitting allows for the consideration of the particularities of embodiment, since misfitting doesn't rely on a kind of generic body delineated simply by top-down identity categories. This is parallel to Crenshaw's account, in which she argues that we have to attend to particular locations, particular experiences of particular people, rather than an identity politics that talks about simply the category of race or the category of gender, because it's not clear who embodies those categories. Similarly, Garland-Thomson is trying to give an account of disability that doesn't fill out a kind of abstract, disembodied category of disabled persons, but rather requires us to attend to the particularities of embodiment. So who one is, one's identity, is fluid, and it transforms in a constantly shifting environment. Further, the concept of misfit is associated with disability since it arises out of disability theory. In fact, the term was coined by Garland-Thomson in this essay. It has become used quite commonly in disability studies, but its application, according to Garland-Thomson, extends beyond this cultural category, beyond the category of persons with disabilities. In fact, Garland-Thomson thinks that misfitting is a fundamental fact of human embodiment. This is not just a concept that applies to persons with disabilities, because it illuminates issues of contingency and instability, which have been recently discussed in feminism more generally as dependence and vulnerability. So recall Beauvoir on the one hand, and recall Crenshaw on the other. So the concept of misfits allows embodiment, in its particularity, to be at the center of our understandings of social relations and social structures, subject formation, identity, interpersonal relations, and bioethics, or medical ethics. Thus, persons are not abstracted into generic autonomous subjects separate from others. And again, you could look at the tension between texts like de Beauvoir's and Crenshaw's. De Beauvoir's giving an account where she said, hey, you individual, transcend your difference as other and become a subject. There's little consideration in that solution with our particular embodiments with our material environments, whereas on Crenshaw's account, Crenshaw's saying, look, we have to think about the lived environment that women of color face in order to propose helpful policy changes, resources, and forms of activism that can mitigate oppression for these women. So generic categories and disembodied autonomous subjects are a kind of myth of Western culture that comes to us from a tradition of liberalism in our society. But vulnerability is a way to describe the potential that all humans have for misfitting, regardless of their particular embodiments. We have to understand vulnerability in the appropriate way. Vulnerability is not simply a kind of neediness or fragility, but it's a fact about our embodied existence. Our existence just is contingent. Our existence grows from particular social and material locations in which we are vulnerable to wounding, injury, pain, suffering, and death. These are facts about our embodied existence. And so being human beings entails some level of vulnerability. Thus, dependence is a universal need of all human beings for care or sustenance. And so the myth of autonomy as such obscures the fact of our need for care from others and our interdependence on others and on our material environments. You should recall Wendell's argument where she describes the UN definition of disability. Garland-Thomson, in this more recent essay, notes that the UN adopted a new protocol stating that disability is an evolving concept and it results from the interaction between persons with impairments and the social attitudes and environmental barriers that hinder persons' full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with other members of society. So, based on the new UN definition, vulnerability is in the fit, it's not in the body itself. So it's not that particular bodies are vulnerable, it's that the relation between bodies and environments are vulnerable to fitting or misfitting. And this vulnerability is realized when certain bodies encounter hostile environments, whereas vulnerability is latent or lies below the surface in relations where bodies are sustained by certain environments. So to fit is to be in a relation with an environment that sustains the form, function, and needs of a particular body. A misfit occurs when the world fails the flesh in the environment. For example, a misfit occurs when someone in a wheelchair approaches a flight of stairs, when a non-hearing person enters a boardroom full of misogynists, when someone contracts an illness or injury, when a person of color approaches a whites-only country club, when someone finds themselves in an environment with sub-zero temperatures, when there is a natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina. All of these are misfits where the world fails the flesh. The world fails particular bodies. So it's a fact of life that as human beings we just are vulnerable. Yet our bodies are also the agents of our lived experience. So our lived experience is not merely social or narrative. Our lived experience depends upon our particular embodiments. So in terms of agency, the experience of misfitting can produce subjugated knowledge from which a liberatory politics could be launched. Wendell also makes this point. And this is also related especially to Crenshaw and the Combahee River Collective's Black Feminist Statement. So misfitting can materialize epistemically privileged positions, and misfittings can become fittings. The way we understand oppression can be reconceptualized by stressing the relational nature of misfits rather than the hierarchical nature of subjugation. So reality is a product of contextual relations. It's not a set of stable atomistic essences. So it's not merely a matter of a white person oppressing a person of color, or a man oppressing a woman, or an able-bodied person oppressing a disabled person. Misfitting forces an acknowledgement that injustice and discrimination are not simply social attitudes, but they're lodged in the materiality of the world and the built environment. So misfitting can operate independently of oppressive agents or oppressive groups. It's in the built environment. It's in our technologies, our buildings, our tools, our resources. Historically, misfits have not only been devalued, but purged through projects of eugenics, recall the Rwandan genocide, and of course the Holocaust, through lynching, recall a history of black slavery and segregation in the United States, the prison industrial complex, coercive heteronormativity, again recall Fausto Sterling's account, as well as McKinnon's account, and the Americans with Disabilities Act and other legislation has worked against these actions. So a revaluing of the particularities we think of as impairment or deviance could bring forward strategies that disabled persons need to survive and flourish. Misfits are agents of recognition. They can challenge and rearrange environments to achieve equality and social justice by cultivating particularity. And misfitting can yield new innovative perspectives, knowledge, and skills that experiences of fitting cannot produce. Being born with disabilities often fosters a kind of adaptability and resourcefulness that is underdeveloped in persons born with bodies that tend to fit smoothly in their environments. One of the key takeaways from Garland-Thomson's piece is that our politics should not focus on what we are, but what we want.